The moment I heard the knock on my front door at 7 in the morning, I already knew something was wrong. Nobody knocks on your door at 7 in the morning in the middle of January unless there's a burst pipe, a car accident in the driveway, or an HOA board member who has decided that your personal peace and quiet is a community violation. I pulled back the curtain and looked out. There she was. Janet Winthrop, standing on my front porch in her enormous puffy coat that made her look like a marshmallow that had learned to walk upright, clutching her little clipboard like it was the Declaration of Independence, her breath fogging up the air in sharp little clouds. I sighed, pulled on my hoodie, and opened the door. Outside was brutal. We'd gotten 8 inches of snow the night before, and another 4 were expected by evening. The whole neighborhood looked like a snow globe someone had shaken and then abandoned. My driveway had a solid inch of new powder on top of the 6 inches I'd already shoveled the previous afternoon. My truck was buried up to its door handles. The temperature was sitting somewhere around 11 degrees, with a wind chill that made it feel like the Arctic had decided to relocate to suburban Ohio. And here was Janet Winthrop, standing on my porch looking like she'd been waiting her whole life for this exact moment. "Good morning, Tom," she said, and the way she said it told me it was absolutely not going to be a good morning. "Janet," I said. She looked past me into my house for a second, then snapped her eyes back to me like she was pulling them away from something tempting but not quite legal. She lifted the clipboard. "Tom, it has come to the attention of the Maplewood Commons Homeowners Association that you have placed an unauthorized propane tank on the side of your house. Specifically on the east-facing exterior wall, adjacent to the utility area." I stared at her. "You mean my backup propane tank," I said. "I mean the unapproved structure you have erected without submitting Form Arc 7B to the Architectural Review Committee for pre-approval." I took a long breath and reminded myself that it was 7 in the morning and I hadn't had coffee yet, and doing something dramatic before coffee was never a good idea. "Janet," I said slowly, "it is a propane tank, not a structure. It's a portable tank that I set there because we're in the middle of a winter storm, and my primary tank is almost empty, and the delivery service can't get a truck out here until next week because the roads are iced over." She wrote something on her clipboard. "Regardless of the circumstances," she said without looking up, "the Maplewood Commons HOA Covenant, Article 9, Section 3, Subsection D, clearly states that any installation, placement, or erection of equipment, including but not limited to tanks, generators, utility boxes, and similar apparatus, visible from a neighboring property or common area, requires prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I looked past her at my side yard. The tank was behind a 6-foot wooden privacy fence. It was a standard 100-pound propane cylinder, the kind you'd see at any hardware store, sitting on a concrete pad next to my gas meter. It was not visible from any neighboring property unless your neighbor was standing on their roof with binoculars. "Who complained?" I asked. She straightened up and gave me the smile she always gave when she had information she was not going to share. "That is confidential HOA business," she said. "Janet, it's behind my fence. The Keller property has a second-floor window with a direct sightline to your utility area." I thought about the Kellers. They were a perfectly nice couple who mostly kept to themselves, and had never once complained about anything in the 7 years I'd lived next to them. Then I thought about Janet Winthrop, who had once filed a complaint against Dave Morrow on Birchwood Court because his Christmas lights were the wrong shade of white. Did the Kellers actually complain? I asked. "A concerned resident brought this to the board's attention," she said carefully. There it was. Translation: Janet had either driven around the neighborhood looking for things to write up, or she had walked into the Kellers' yard, looked over my fence, spotted the tank, and invented a complaint to give herself standing to do this. Either way, the Kellers hadn't actually said a word. "Okay," I said. "What exactly do you want me to do about it? The temperature is 11 degrees. I have a gas furnace. If I remove that backup tank and my primary runs out before the delivery comes next week, my heat goes out. She gave me the clipboard. You have 72 hours to either remove the tank from the property or submit a completed ARC 7B for review. How long does the ARC review take? Standard review is 14 business days. I looked at her. She looked at me. So my choices are to freeze, or to wait 14 business days for a committee to decide whether a propane tank is aesthetically appropriate, during which time I will also freeze. I don't make the rules, Tom, she said, which was a complete and documented lie, because Janet Winthrop had been on the HOA board for 9 years and had personally rewritten large portions of the covenant during her tenure, specifically to give herself more authority over things exactly like this. She handed me the formal notice, a yellow carbon copy sheet that smelled like old printer ink, turned around and walked carefully down my icy porch steps, which I noticed she hadn't complained about, despite the fact that they hadn't been fully cleared yet because it was 7 in the morning and the snow had just stopped falling an hour ago. I watched her make her way to her own car, which was a gray Volvo she kept polished to an almost aggressive shine even in winter, and I thought about what a propane tank had to do with neighborhood aesthetics when it was sitting behind a solid wooden fence in 11-degree weather. Then I went inside, made coffee, and started thinking. Here's the thing about Janet Winthrop that most people in Maplewood Commons had figured out by around year 3 of her time on the board. She was not motivated by community standards or neighborhood aesthetics. She was motivated by control. She had a very specific idea about how everything in the neighborhood should look and function, and that idea centered heavily on whatever made Janet Winthrop comfortable and whatever gave Janet Winthrop the most authority. She had a talent for finding obscure covenant language and wielding it like a weapon, and she had a gift for timing her complaints so they caused maximum inconvenience. But here's what Janet didn't know about me. I had moved to Maplewood Commons from another HOA community, one that had been twice as aggressive and 3 times as litigious as this one, and the experience had taught me a few things. I knew how to read a covenant. I knew when an HOA was acting outside its authority, and I had made a point, from the day I moved into this neighborhood, of documenting everything. I sat down with my coffee and pulled up the Maplewood Commons HOA covenant on my laptop. Article 9, Section 3, Subsection D, I read it twice. Then I read the definition section at the front of the document, because HOA covenants are legal documents and the definitions at the front of a legal document matter enormously. The covenant defined installation as any permanent affixing, mounting, or connecting of equipment to the property's structure or ground. It defined erection the same way. It defined placement as the permanent or semi-permanent positioning of objects intended to remain in a fixed location indefinitely. My propane tank was sitting on an existing concrete pad. It was not affixed to the house. It was not mounted. It was not connected to anything except a standard regulator hose. It was temporary, because the whole point was that I was going to use it until my scheduled delivery arrived, and then it was going back to the garage. By the covenant's own definitions, what I had done didn't qualify as an installation, erection, or placement in the technical sense the document used. I wrote all of this down in a Word document, cited the specific sections, and added the date and time. Then I called my neighbor Mike Castellano, who lived 2 houses down and had also received HOA harassment in the past over his fence height, and who had since made a hobby of knowing HOA law. Mike was an electrician by trade, but he read homeowner association regulations the way some people read detective novels, with intense focus and visible satisfaction when something didn't add up. He answered on the second ring, which told me he was already awake, probably because he'd been out shoveling. "Tom, please tell me you called because something interesting happened," he said. Janet was at my door at 7 in the morning about my backup propane tank. There was a pause, and then Mike made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough. "The one you set up because your primary is running low." The very same. And she's calling it a structure that needs pre-approval. She cited Article 9, Section 3, Subsection D. Mike was quiet for about 4 seconds, and I could hear him moving around, probably going to find something to write on. Okay, he said. First of all, that subsection was amended in 2019, and the amendment added a specific emergency exemption clause that the board never publicized. It's in the amendment appendix at the back of the document. Most people don't know it's there because Janet never mentioned it at any of the meetings where it would have been relevant. I pulled up the appendix. There it was. Amendment 9D1, adopted March 2019. It read, notwithstanding the provisions of Section 3, Subsection D, temporary placement of emergency utility equipment, including propane generator and similar devices, necessitated by weather events, supply interruption, or utility failure, shall not require prior ARC approval, provided such placement does not exceed 30 calendar days, and the equipment is stored in a manner that does not create a safety hazard. I read it out loud to Mike. Yep, he said. She knows about that amendment. She voted on it. She just forgot that you'd actually look. Or she assumed I wouldn't, I said. Same thing. What do you want to do? I thought about it for a second. I could call Janet, cite the amendment, and end it there. That was probably the cleanest option. But the more I thought about 7 in the morning, 11 degrees, carbon copy notices, and a woman who had spent 9 years making other people's lives harder for reasons that had nothing to do with community improvement, the more I thought that maybe this was an opportunity to do something a little more lasting than just making the complaint go away. I want to document this properly, I said. And I want to find out if she's pulled this move on anyone else recently. Mike made a sound of approval. I'll start making calls, he said. Call your buddy Ray too. He got a notice last month. Ray Kowalski lived on the other side of the neighborhood on Sycamore Loop, and he'd mentioned something in passing a few weeks back about an HOA letter over his generator. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Now it was starting to feel like a pattern. I called Ray. Ray answered sounding like a man who had been shoveling for 2 hours and was powered by spite and black coffee. Tom, what's up? Did you get an HOA notice about your generator? 2 weeks ago, yeah. Janet said I needed to submit the architectural review form for it. Same form, ARC 7B. I told her it was an emergency generator for when the power went out, and she said it didn't matter. It needed pre-approval. Did you know about the 2019 amendment that specifically exempts emergency utility equipment from that requirement? Long silence. I did not know that, Ray said. Janet voted on it herself. Another silence, this one with different energy. What are you thinking? Ray asked. I'm thinking we figure out who else has gotten letters like this recently. And I'm thinking we figure out if Janet's been selectively enforcing rules she knows don't actually apply, and whether that pattern constitutes something the board needs to hear about formally. I could hear Ray starting to warm up to this idea in real time. There's a board meeting next Thursday, he said. I know. The agenda is already set, but residents have a 15-minute open comment period at the start. I know that too, I said. Get me names. Anyone who got an ARC notice in the last 6 months for utility equipment. I'm going to pull the actual records. The HOA was required by Ohio state law to maintain records of all board decisions, notices, and meeting minutes, and to make those records available to residents within a reasonable time frame upon written request. I knew this because it was in Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.1, which I had looked up years ago and bookmarked specifically for situations like this. I sent a formal written request to the HOA's management email that same morning, time-stamped, requesting all ARC 7B submissions and associated notices from the previous 12 months. In the meantime, the snow kept coming. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, and we'd gotten another 2 inches on top of the original 8. My street was a complete mess. The plows had come through once in the early morning, but the snow was falling faster than the county could clear it, and by afternoon, The roads in our neighborhood were basically one lane of packed snow with ice underneath, hemmed in by walls of cleared snow on either side. The delivery trucks weren't going anywhere. The propane company confirmed my delivery was pushed to the following Wednesday at the earliest. I went out in the afternoon to check the primary tank gauge. It was sitting just under 10%. With the furnace running hard in this weather, I figured I had maybe 2 days of heat left in it before I'd be drawing on the backup. The backup tank had about 40 pounds of propane in it, which would keep the furnace running for a good while once the primary kicked out. The whole setup was perfectly legal, perfectly safe, and perfectly sensible for exactly the situation I was in. I took pictures of both tanks, the gauge on the primary, and the placement of the backup behind the fence. I documented everything. That evening, Mike sent me a list of 6 other residents who had received ARC 7B notices from Janet in the past 4 months for utility equipment: a portable generator, a second generator, 2 propane tanks, a small propane heater placed on a covered porch, a battery backup system installed in a garage. 6 residents, all of whom had utility equipment flagged by Janet, all of whom had been threatened with the same 72-hour compliance notice, and none of whom had apparently known about Amendment 9D1. I contacted all 6 of them over the next 2 days, either by phone or by walking over in the cold, which at least gave me something to do while I waited out the storm. They were all various degrees of annoyed, confused, and in some cases genuinely stressed. 2 of them had actually removed their generators because of Janet's notices, which meant they'd spent the worst week of winter without backup power, because an HOA board member had cited a rule she knew didn't apply to them. One of those 2 was an elderly woman named Evelyn Marsh, who lived on Birchwood Court, and whose power had gone out for 18 hours during a particularly bad night of freezing rain. She'd spent that night wearing 3 layers of sweaters and praying her pipes didn't burst. I sat with that information for a minute. That crossed a line that was different from inconvenience. That was real harm. Evelyn was 72 and lived alone, and she'd gone without heat for 18 hours in freezing weather because Janet Winthrop had sent her a notice citing a covenant exemption she knew existed and chose not to mention. I talked to Mike about it. "That starts looking like a lot more than aggressive enforcement," Mike said, and he was choosing his words carefully in the way he always did when he was actually angry but being precise about it. "If she's issuing notices she knows are inaccurate, that's potentially fraudulent misrepresentation. If it caused real harm to a resident, that's something else." I looked up the Ohio HOA statutes again that night, and I found something interesting. Under Ohio law, HOA board members have a fiduciary duty to the residents of the association. They are required to act in the best interests of the community, to enforce rules consistently and honestly, and to accurately represent the association's governing documents. Misrepresenting the content of those documents in official communications could potentially constitute a breach of fiduciary duty. And if that misrepresentation caused financial harm, like forcing someone to remove equipment they'd paid for or causing property damage from pipes that froze, it could also give rise to civil liability. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd read enough HOA case law from my previous experience to know when something was worth bringing to an actual lawyer. I called my cousin Sarah, who was a real estate attorney over in Columbus. She was the kind of lawyer who genuinely enjoyed HOA cases because she said they were the legal equivalent of watching someone try to use a fly swatter as a weapon in a sword fight. She told me to send her everything I had, which I did, and she called me back the next morning. "Okay," she said, "a few things. First, you personally are clearly fine. The amendment covers you. The tank is temporary, it's behind a fence. There's no safety hazard, and the notice Janet gave you is legally invalid on its face. So your immediate problem is resolved. Second, the pattern you've described is worth looking at much more carefully. 6 additional residents, notices citing a rule with a known exemption, removal of emergency equipment resulting in one case in a documented safety risk to a vulnerable elderly resident. That's a pattern of selective and potentially misleading enforcement. Can we do something about it? I asked. You can start by going through the HOA's own internal process, Sarah said. The board has the authority to remove a board member for misconduct. You need to bring this to the full board, not just Janet, because Janet is one member and the others may not be aware of what she's been doing, or they may not have scrutinized these notices as carefully as you have. If you bring documented evidence to the board and they do nothing, then you're looking at filing a complaint with the county, potentially a civil suit for damages on behalf of the affected residents, and a mandatory audit of the board's decision-making under Ohio Revised Code. What about Evelyn Marsh specifically? I asked. She's 72 and she lost heat for 18 hours because of a notice she shouldn't have received. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Get me a statement from her. Written. Her health, any medical effects from the cold, the timeline. If she had any medical costs related to it, those records too. That's potentially a civil claim for negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. I thanked her and ended the call feeling like the situation had shifted significantly from an annoying knock on the door at 7 in the morning to something with real teeth. The board meeting was Thursday evening. That gave me 4 days to prepare. I spent those 4 days in a cold but extremely productive state of focused activity. I shoveled my driveway every morning, watched my primary tank gauge creep down, switched over to the backup on Tuesday when the primary ran out, and spent my evenings compiling a presentation for the board meeting that was tidy, factual, sourced, and devastating in the way that only well-organized, documented evidence can be devastating. I had the 7 notices, all with Janet's name on them. I had the text of Amendment 9D1 highlighted. I had a timeline of events for each of the 7 affected residents. I had Evelyn Marsh's written statement, which she'd given me sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and a look in her eyes that was equal parts sad and furious. I had photos. I had the HOA's own meeting minutes from March 2019, which showed Janet Winthrop present and voting in favor of Amendment 9D1. I had my formal records request and the response from the HOA, which confirmed all 7 of the ARC 7B notices I'd identified. And I had something else. Something I hadn't expected. Ray Kowalski's doorbell camera faced the street, and because of the angle of his property and the curve of Sycamore Loop, it also captured a portion of his side yard where his generator had been sitting. When Ray went back through his footage from the day he received his HOA notice, he found something interesting. It showed Janet Winthrop walking down his driveway, along the side of his house, past his fence, and standing in his side yard for several minutes, apparently examining the generator up close. She had walked onto Ray's private property without his permission, without notice, and without any legal authority to do so. She had then returned to the street and apparently used what she'd seen as the basis for his HOA notice, which meant she had trespassed on private property to gather evidence for an enforcement action. HOA board members do not have the right to enter private property without permission. This is not a gray area. It is a clear violation. Ray sent me the footage. I sent it to Sarah. Sarah made a sound on the phone that I recognized as an attorney discovering a fact pattern she really liked. That's trespass, she said. And depending on what she did with what she found, it could also affect the validity of any enforcement action taken based on that inspection. Plus, it opens her up to a civil claim personally, not just a claim against the HOA. Is this going to the police? I asked. That's up to Ray, she said. But yes, he could file a trespass complaint and it would be a legitimate one. I talked to Ray. Ray, who had spent 2 weeks without a working generator in the middle of winter because of a notice he should never have received, thought about it for all of about 15 seconds before saying yes. The day before the board meeting, Ray went to the local police department and filed a report. The officer who took the report, A patient man named Officer Hicks, who had apparently dealt with HOA situations before, watched the footage on Ray's phone, made notes, and said he'd look into it. He took Ray's contact information and told him to keep the footage. That night I barely slept, but not because of the cold. The propane delivery had finally made it through on Wednesday afternoon. A cheerful guy named Phil who'd maneuvered a delivery truck down our iced-over street with impressive skill, and my tanks were full. The house was warm. I was just too keyed up to sleep much. Thursday came in gray and bitter, with a sky the color of old concrete and a wind that cut through everything. The board meeting was at 7 in the evening at the Maplewood Commons clubhouse, a squat beige building next to the retention pond that had been frozen solid for 2 weeks. I arrived at 6:30. I was not the first one there. Mike was already there. Ray was there. Evelyn Marsh was there, which surprised me a little because she didn't go to many board meetings, but she had apparently made an exception for this one. The other 4 affected residents were there too. Some of them had brought spouses. By the time 7 o'clock came around, the meeting room was significantly more full than a typical January board meeting, which usually drew 6 people on a good night. Janet Winthrop walked in at 6:58, saw the room, and for just a moment her expression changed in a way that told me she understood that something was different about tonight. Then she pulled it back into her normal boardroom face, that pleasant, slightly condescending expression of someone who believes they are in charge and intends to stay that way. The board had 3 other members besides Janet. There was Gary Peterson, who was the board president, a retired teacher who was generally reasonable but tended to defer to Janet on enforcement issues because she always came so thoroughly prepared. There was Linda Acaffer, who had been on the board for 2 years and was mostly involved in the landscaping and common area issues. And there was Bob Hurley, who was new to the board and who I didn't know well yet. Gary called the meeting to order and opened the resident comment period. I stood up. I had 15 minutes. I used every second of them. I started with the basics: who I was, what had happened on Monday morning, Janet's notice, the 2019 amendment she'd cited to give it authority, and the text of Amendment 9D1 that specifically invalidated the notice she'd given me. I read the amendment out loud. I showed the page. Gary leaned forward. Linda picked up her own copy of the covenant and started flipping through the appendix. Then I moved to the other 6 residents and invited each of them to briefly confirm their experience. Each one said their piece. Janet sat very still during all of this, her pen moving occasionally on her notepad, her expression carefully controlled. Then I talked about Evelyn Marsh. Evelyn stood up and read her statement herself, quietly and clearly, and the room was very quiet while she did. She described receiving the notice, feeling confused and intimidated by the official language, deciding to comply, removing her generator, and then losing power for 18 hours on one of the coldest nights of the year. She described how cold her house had gotten. She described her concern about her pipes. She described being frightened. She sat down. The silence afterward was the kind that is weight. "Janet," Gary said, and his voice had something in it that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago, "did you know about Amendment 9D1 when you issued these notices?" Janet looked at Gary steadily. "I issue notices based on the main covenant text," she said. "The amendments can be complex and are subject to interpretation." "The amendment is not complex," I said, holding up the page. "It uses plain language. Emergency utility equipment in winter is exempt. Full stop." "I was acting in what I believed were the best interests of the community," Janet said. "You voted for that amendment in March 2019, Mike said from his seat. "You were in the room." Janet's jaw tightened slightly. "Were you aware of the amendment when you issued the notices?" Gary asked again, more directly. "The architectural review process is important to maintain neighborhood standards," Janet said, which was not an answer to the question. Gary made a note. Then I put the footage on the table. I had borrowed a laptop from Mike and I played Ray's doorbell camera footage on the screen, showing Janet walking down Ray's driveway onto his property, past his fence, and into his side yard without permission. The footage was clear, time-stamped, and unmistakable. You could see her face. The room's energy shifted significantly. "That is private property," Gary said, not really to anyone in particular, more like he was processing it out loud. "It is," I said, "and Ray filed a trespass report with the police yesterday." Janet put down her pen. "I was performing a routine enforcement inspection," she said. "There is no provision in the covenant or in Ohio law that authorizes a board member to enter private property for an enforcement inspection without prior notice and owner consent," I said. I had the relevant Ohio statute number written on my notepad, and I read it out. Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.12 specifies the conditions under which an HOA may inspect private property. An unannounced entry without consent is not among them. Bob Hurley, the newest board member, turned to look at Janet with an expression that was clearly recalibrating several months of prior assumptions. "Janet," Gary said, "I think we need to pause the regular meeting agenda. I'm calling for an executive session." The board went into executive session in the adjoining room. The rest of us waited. It took 41 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock and so was everyone else in the room. During those 41 minutes, Mike and I talked quietly. Evelyn had another cup of tea from the little coffee station in the corner. Ray said almost nothing, but looked like a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was finally watching it arrive. When the board came back in, Gary looked tired but resolved, the look of someone who has made a decision they know is the right one even though it's uncomfortable. "After reviewing the information presented tonight," Gary said, "the board has determined that 7 enforcement notices issued in the past 4 months were issued in error, as the situations described fall under Amendment 9D1 of the Covenant and do not require ARC approval. Those notices are hereby rescinded. Any fees or penalties associated with those notices are also rescinded." He paused. "Additionally, the board is opening a formal review of the board member conduct involved in the issuance of those notices, to be completed within 30 days, with findings to be reported to all residents. During that review period, Janet Winthrop is asked to voluntarily recuse herself from enforcement decisions." He looked at Janet. Janet looked back at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the room. Then she gathered her clipboard, stood up, and walked out. She didn't say anything. She just left. The room watched her go, and then people started exhaling. That wasn't quite the end of it, of course. The good parts rarely end in one clean moment. The police looked into the trespass report. Officer Hicks came back to Ray with the results of their review about 10 days later. The footage was clear enough and the circumstances straightforward enough that they issued Janet Winthrop a citation for criminal trespass, which in Ohio at that level is a 4th-degree misdemeanor. It wasn't a felony, it wasn't prison, but it was a criminal citation. It went on her record, and it required her to appear in court. She appeared. She had a lawyer who argued that the trespass was incidental and conducted in good faith as part of a community enforcement role. The judge, a patient woman who had clearly also dealt with HOA situations before, pointed out that good faith does not authorize trespass and that no community enforcement role gives a private citizen the right to enter another's private property without permission. Janet was found guilty. She paid a fine. She received a formal conviction on her record. That was the moment she resigned from the HOA board. She sent a brief written notice to Gary saying she was stepping down for personal reasons, and that was it. 9 years of control over Maplewood Commons ended in a single typed paragraph. The board's 30-day review of her enforcement conduct produced a document that was, honestly, something to read. It turned out the pattern went back further than 6 months. There were notices going back 2 years that cited covenant provisions without mentioning applicable amendments or exceptions. There were enforcement actions that had been applied to some residents but not others in identical situations. which is a separate problem from the missing amendments because selective enforcement of HOA rules is itself a legal issue, one that can expose the association to discrimination claims depending on how the selection was made. The review board, working with Sarah, my cousin the attorney, who had agreed to consult for a very reasonable fee because she was enjoying herself, recommended a full audit of all enforcement notices issued in the past 3 years, a rewriting of the ARC notice templates to include references to applicable amendments and exceptions, a new policy requiring all enforcement notices to be reviewed by a second board member before issuance, and a formal apology and written confirmation to all 7 residents who had received invalid notices. Gary signed all of it. Linda Acaffer and Bob Hurley signed too. The audit happened over about 6 weeks and turned up another 11 notices in the prior 3 years that were issued without reference to exceptions that applied, though fortunately none of those appeared to have caused the kind of direct harm that Evelyn Marsh's situation had. Evelyn's situation was handled separately. With Sarah's help, Evelyn filed a civil claim against the HOA for the incident with her generator. The HOA's insurance carrier, after reviewing the facts, negotiated a settlement with Evelyn that covered her legal costs and provided her with compensation for the distress and the risk she'd been put through. It wasn't a huge sum of money, but it was real, and it was an acknowledgement that what happened to her was not acceptable. The HOA also paid for a professional review of their entire governing document by an actual HOA law firm, and the resulting update to the covenant was made available to all residents, in plain English, with a properly organized appendix that made the amendments and exceptions easy to find and read, something that should have been done years ago. I want to be clear that not everything about this was heroic or cinematic. A lot of it was me sitting at my kitchen table in the cold, reading documents, writing emails, making phone calls, and being deeply grateful that I had a warm house to do it in because my backup propane tank was exactly where it was supposed to be, behind my fence, doing its job. The propane tank itself remained on the side of my house until Phil came back with another delivery in late February, at which point I moved the backup tank back into the garage, where it lives when it's not needed. It is a perfectly ordinary tank. It is not pretty or interesting or architecturally significant. It is just a piece of equipment that kept my house warm during a particularly nasty winter, and I am very glad I had it. The neighborhood changed after all of this, and I mean that in a real and specific way, not a vague feel-good way. People talk to each other more. When you go through a situation where a shared problem brings a bunch of neighbors into a room together, some of those connections stick. I knew Ray Kowalski well enough already, but I got to know some of the other residents I'd barely spoken to before this. The couple on the other end of Sycamore Loop who'd had their generator flagged, the Pattersons, started hosting a monthly neighborhood coffee in their basement during the winter months, just as a casual thing, and it became actually popular. Evelyn Marsh, I checked in on her a few more times during the rest of the winter. She was fine. She was more than fine, actually. She told me she'd been a little hesitant to make a fuss when she got Janet's notice because she didn't want to cause trouble, and that the whole experience had reminded her that sometimes you have to push back. She said it in a calm, matter-of-fact way that suggested she was someone who had pushed back on things before in her life and had simply gotten a little out of the habit. The new HOA board elected 2 additional members in the spring to replace Janet and to give the board a broader perspective, and both of them were people I'd met through this whole situation. Good people. Practical, sensible, genuinely interested in the community rather than in controlling it. The board meetings became shorter and less contentious because the rules were clearer and the enforcement was transparent and consistent. As for Janet Winthrop, I saw her once in early spring at the gas station on Route 12. We were both filling up our cars and we made eye contact across the pump island. She looked like she'd had a complicated winter, which I suppose was accurate. I gave her a small nod. She gave me one back. And that was the entirety of our interaction, which felt about right. I'm not someone who wanted to destroy anybody. I just wanted my propane tank where I needed it to be, my heat running through January, and an HOA that operated honestly. 3 out of 3 isn't bad. Looking back on it, the thing that strikes me most is how straightforward the whole situation was, underneath the drama. A woman with too much authority and not enough accountability had been cutting corners and misrepresenting rules to the people she was supposed to serve. And when someone actually read the documents carefully and compared what was happening to what the rules actually said, the whole thing came apart pretty quickly. The rules existed. The protections existed. The legal framework existed. It just needed someone to actually look. I keep a copy of Amendment 9D1 now, printed out, in the drawer by my back door, right next to the flashlight and the extra batteries. I figure those are all things worth having handy when the weather gets bad. Winter doesn't last forever. The snow melted by mid-March. The roads cleared. The delivery trucks started running on schedule again, and Maplewood Commons settled back into the ordinary rhythms of a neighborhood in the part of the year where people go back to worrying about lawn height and flower bed choices rather than heating and propane and frozen pipes. But every now and then, when someone in the neighborhood gets an HOA notice that doesn't sit right with them, they know who to call. And I'm happy to sit down with a cup of coffee and read through whatever document is involved, because honestly, I've gotten pretty good at it. The backup tank lives in my garage now, next to the snowblower and the extension cords, waiting for the next time it's needed. I keep it full. I keep the receipt for the propane, and I keep all my HOA documentation organized, dated, and easily accessible, because experience has taught me that the best defense against someone who wants to misuse a rule is knowing the rule better than they do. My neighbor's dog still barks at the gas meter, for reasons nobody has ever figured out. The Keller's second-floor window still has a direct sightline to my utility area. And the concrete pad on the side of my house is clean and empty and completely, officially, pre-approved for whatever I need to put on it in an emergency. Maplewood Commons is a good neighborhood. It always was, mostly. It just needed a little propane-fueled winter clarity to remind everyone of that. Outside right now, looking through my kitchen window, the neighborhood is quiet and normal and a little boring, and I mean that as a compliment. The mailboxes are all the right color. The fences are all the right height, the street is clear, everybody's heat is working. And somewhere in a county courthouse filing, there's a trespass conviction attached to the name of someone who used to have a lot of power over this little corner of Ohio, and doesn't anymore. That, as far as I'm concerned, is a perfectly good ending to a winter story.